Good morning, Allison. There are a number of factors that Montgomery County is taking into consideration before thinking about reinstating a mask mandate throughout the county. We're live this morning in downtown Bethesda. This is along Bethesda Road, one of the areas that was created, an outside eatery area that was created so businesses could continue to serve their patrons throughout the pandemic. Montgomery County was also one of the last counties within the state of Maryland to kind of ease some of those restrictions earlier this summer. But here's a look at the CDC guidance and what they're considering, some of the variables they're considering before reinstating a mask mandate. The CDC is recommending where there are more than 50 cases per 100,000 people over the course of 7 days, you wear a mask. Montgomery County is well under that metric, averaging around 30 new cases per 100,000 people in the last 7 days. I spoke with Dr. Travis Gales, the health officer and chief of public health services for Montgomery County, and he says they're assessing a host of things like the number of new cases as they increase that correlates with the number of people who are hospitalized after contracting the virus as well. He says that gives them a better sense of how severe the threat is. He also tells me that 70.5% of the eligible population within the county are already fully vaccinated, and that's another one of the factors in determining the next steps to keep everyone safe. But that also means that hundreds of thousands of people are still unvaccinated, and that remains concerning.
The reason why we are potentially moving in a direction where we might consider reinstalling the mask mandate and those types of requirements is we really truly want to drive down community transmission as much as possible as we reopen things and provide protection to residents, for example, our children who are not eligible yet to get the vaccine, and to any of our other residents due to their medical conditions who may be immunocompromised, who are still at risk.
Ultimately, they need people to keep getting vaccinated if they meet the requirements to do so. He says that the county has consolidated some of those mass vaccination sites, but there's still a number of places where you can go and get that coronavirus vaccine or get tested if you need to. We have that information for you right now on our website. That's WUSA9.com. But as for right now, Montgomery County has not reinstated a mask mandate, and they will continue to monitor this very fluid situation. Reporting live in downtown Bethesda, I'm Megan Rivers. Allison, I'll send things back to you in the studio.